Okay, so with the endocrine system, the main thing to understand is that the endocrine system looks at hormones. So this is looking at the tissues and the glands that produce hormones. So what is a hormone? So a hormone is something that is produced by an endocrine tissue or an endocrine gland. How it works is that the tissue or the gland, there are secreting cells. These secreting cells produce hormones that they make, and these hormones then travel into the blood. And then once they go into the blood, they then travel a long distance and then they can go out of the bloodstream to a target cell in a target organ. And then once the hormone binds a receptor that has a complementary shape, the binding of the receptor to the hormone produces a change in the target cell. So essentially, a hormone is a messenger because once it binds to a receptor, it produces a change in the receptor cell or the cell that has the receptor. And that change that happens essentially is the same thing as a message being carried out. And so we have two different types of hormone classes. There's the hormones that bind to the surface of the cell, and then there's the hormones that bind to receptors inside the cell. So let's look at the ones that bind the receptors inside the cell. One thing about them is that they are small, they're nonpolar, and they're hydrophobic or lipophilic. And these are all big terms, but let's just break it down. Your typical cell membrane is made up of phospholipids. So what does that say about the bilayer? The bilayer is fatty in nature. So I'm just going to write fatty beside the plasma membrane. So that means that um, it's pretty hard for stuff that is water loving to go through the plasma membrane. The only things that can go through the plasma membrane are usually things that are lipophilic, which is lipid loving, or things that are hydrophobic, which means water hating. So these are the things that can go through the plasma membrane. And then if it happens to be something that is polar or, hydrophilic, it's okay as far as it's small. So we also have some instances where a small molecule can go through this plasma membrane. But generally, for it to go through, it has to be small. It has to be nonpolar, which means it doesn't have to have any charges distributed in the molecule, or it has to be hydrophobic or lipophilic. So essentially, it has to be fatty in nature or small. And so once they go through, because they're able to go through, they're able to bind the complementary receptor that's inside the cell. Once they bind the receptor, it makes a receptor hormone complex. And actually, once this receptor hormone complex is made, it's able to go through the pores of the nucleus. And then once it goes through there, it binds the nuclear DNA, and the binding of the DNA causes changes in DNA expression. So it might lead to some mRNA being produced and some production of a protein as a result. So some examples of lipid or lipid based or these types of hormones are things that are based on steroids. So your typical steroid is 4 fused rings. There's a lot of carbon, there's a lot of hydrogen in this, but generally this is classed as a lipid because it's usually hydrophobic or lipophilic. So your basic steroid is something like cholesterol. You could also make another steroid like estrogen or testosterone. You also have your aldosterone and then your cortisol. And then there's also some other types that fits into this class. But one type that fits into this class of receptor binding inside the cell hormones is the thyroid hormone. This is actually a bit unusual because thyroid hormones are amino acid derivatives, and we usually class amino acids as something that is usually hydrophilic most of the time. But then because it's able to bind the inside it's because it's able to bind the receptor on the inside of the cell, it's actually in this class. So this is one exception. Thyroid hormones are amino acid derivatives, but yet they are still able to bind the receptors that are inside the cell. And then you also have the other types of hormones that bind the receptors on the surface of the cell. These ones are usually hydrophilic and they're larger hormones. Because they're so large, they have a hard time going through the lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. And also because most of the times they are hydrophilics, which means that they're water loving, they wouldn't interact with the lipid loving phospholipid bilayer. So that means they have no choice but to do their action from the outside. So they would actually bind a transmembrane protein, so a membrane that spans the length of the, or a protein that spans the length of the membrane. So transmembrane protein, they would bind it, they would have a complementary shape. And then once they bind the receptor, they produce a change on the inside of the cell. And then that change gets traveled into the cell. So an example of this is maybe if you bind a hormone receptor that's coupled to a G protein, that G protein ends up throwing away GDP and then binding an energetic GTP. That gives it the ability to travel to an adenylate cyclase. And then once the GTP bound G protein binds the adenylate cyclase, it triggers the production of cyclic AMP from ATP, and this cyclic AMP activates protein kinases, which are a type of enzymes that end up producing the effect in the cell, whether it's the stimulation of some cellular secretions or the activation of some enzymes. This cyclic AMP activates a protein kinase that triggers other things within the cell that transfers the message. So this class of hormones that bind receptors on the outside of the cell, they're very protein peptide based. So they're usually polypeptides or amino acid derivatives. But then remember when we talked about the thyroid hormones? The thyroid hormones are also amino acid derivatives, but keep in mind that those ones bind receptors on the inside of the cell, so they are an exception. But most of our polypeptides and amino acid derivatives do fall in this class of receptors that bind or hormones that bind receptors on the outside of the cell. If we were to compare the action of these hormones that bind on the outside to the ones that bind the inside, you're going to notice that they have a difference in how they act. So generally, these peptide hormones that bind receptors on the outside of the cell, they do tend to have rapid effects. They act really quickly. I want you to think about adrenaline. When your blood is pumping or you're in a fight or flight situation, you're going to produce adrenaline, and then that's going to act on your body really quickly. But once the stimulus or the thing that is triggering your arousal, once it goes away, you cool down moderately quickly. But then something like estrogen or testosterone, those are steroid hormones. They produce long lasting effects because they produce effects that will last a very long time, like, for example, sexual maturity. So, the endocrine system, as I mentioned before, is involved with the creation and then production of hormones. And so the things that actually produce these hormones are called glands. So the production comes from glands. So we have different types of glands that are distributed all throughout the body. Starting from the brain, we have the pituitary gland, which has two parts, the anterior and posterior pituitary. Right above the pituitary gland, we have the hypothalamus, which is the master gland, and we also have the pineal gland, which produces melatonin. All these glands are in the brain. So we see how the brain takes part in the endocrine system. They produce hormones. You have the thyroid gland that is in your neck region, and then you have the thymus gland as well, and then you have the pancreas. You also have the adrenaline glands or the adrenal glands that sit right on top of your kidneys, and then you also have your reproductive organs like your ovaries and your testes. So these two things also produce hormones, specifically hormones that affect your ability to reproduce or your ability to grow sexually in maturity, like breast expansion or, deeper voices, things like that. So here is more of a breakdown for some of the things that they produce. I really encourage you to look at this table. We already talked about a few of these things, like the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, And then we also have the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is really interesting because it produces the parathyroid hormone. And what the parathyroid hormone does is that it increases blood calcium. So it increases the amount of calcium that you have in the blood. You also have the thymus, and then you have the pancreas that produces two other very important hormones. The alpha cells in the pancreas produce glucagon, the beta cells in the pancreas produce insulin. Glucagon is important because what it does is that it increases your blood glucose level. However, the insulin is something that you produce after you eat. And what that does is that it encourages glucose to be absorbed into the cells from the blood. And the result of that is that it reduces glucose in the blood. And then you also have your adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. These produce different hormones, but let's talk about some of these hormones. The adrenal cortex produces your corticosteroids. So what I'm talking about is things like cortisol. Cortisol is your stress hormone. And then you also have the adrenal medulla. That one produces epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. So this is involved in your fight or flight. And then we also have the reproductive organs like ovaries and testes. These produce your steroid-based hormones. Okay, and then the very important gland that we're talking about here is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located in the brain and it sits right above the pituitary gland. So what the hypothalamus does is that the hypothalamus usually triggers the production of hormones from the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. Okay, and so here are some things that the pituitary gland produces. Well, one thing's for sure, the pituitary gland has two different types or two different parts to it. There's the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus stimulates the production of the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland, and you can actually memorize the hormones of the pituitary gland or the anterior pituitary gland using the mnemonic flat peg. So this is a really nice test taking tip. When you're not sure of how to remember stuff, you have a lot of different words that there's just too much going on, then in that case, you can just go ahead and use a mnemonic or some type of acronym. So that's what I'm using in this case, flat pick. That means that the anterior pituitary gland produces follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, ACTH, prolactin, endorphins, growth hormones. These are a lot, but in the future we might jump into that. But there's a lot that the anterior pituitary gland produces, and it's usually triggered, or the secretion of hormones from this is usually triggered by the hypothalamus. And then the posterior pituitary gland is more of a receptacle. So the hypothalamus produces oxytocin and ADH, but then those hormones get stored in the posterior pituitary gland for whenever it's needed. So whenever it's needed, it will get produced by the posterior pituitary gland, but it originally came from the hypothalamus. Okay, so here's one question that we can try out. Which of the following hormones has its receptors located on the cell surface? Well, cell surface hormones are usually your protein and your amino acid hormones. Definitely not steroid hormones. Okay, and also definitely not thyroid hormones. So renin, well, this is a protein, yes, but then it's not a hormone, it's more of an enzyme. So this cannot be our answer. Thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, this is an amino acid derivative, yes, but then at the same time, it falls into that class of hormones that binds receptors on the inside of the cell. Oxytocin. Wow. So this is a protein, yes, and it also is large. So this is likely our answer because it's going to act on the cells by binding receptors located on the surface of the cell. And then aldosterone. Whenever we see this suffix of one, we can we can safely say that it's a steroid. So because of that, it's going to bind a receptor on the inside of the cell. So this is not our answer. So overall, our answer is going to be C.